The mathematics of survival are usually cold, calculated, and predictable. But in the late autumn of 1177, the math broke. A force of 26,000 professional killers didn't just meet an army, they met a ghost. They didn't just lose a battle, they lost their minds. This is not a story of a boy who lived. It is the story of a boy who had already died, and in doing so, became the most dangerous object on the surface of the earth. The desert does not forgive, but it does provide a stage for erasure. In November 1177, that stage was set. Under the black banners of a sultan who had never tasted the bitter ash of defeat, 26,000 men moved like a slow, dark tide across the flatlands of the Holy Land. This was not a border skirmish. It was a surgical operation designed to wipe a sacred city off the map. Saladin did not just want victory. He wanted a vacancy in history. The composition of this force was a nightmare of medieval engineering. At its core were the Mamluks. These were not men born into service. They were weapons manufactured from childhood. Purchased as slave boys from the Central Asian steppes, they were beaten, molded, and trained until their nervous systems were tuned only to the rhythm of war. A Mamluk did not just ride a horse, he integrated with it. He could fire a composite bow at full gallop with a precision that mocked modern marksmen. His arrows did not merely hit, they punctured chainmail as if it were wet parchment. Behind them marched the infantry, columns of spearmen and engineers, dragging the machines of siege. This was an Extinction-level event. Saladin had planned this invasion with the cold detachment of a geopolitical architect. He had mapped the cracks in the Christian kingdom. The empty treasury, the bickering barons, the northern borders bled dry of defenders. He knew his enemy was hemorrhaging. He knew the southern gates were guarded by nothing more than prayers and ghosts. But the most critical variable in Saladin's calculation was the crown. He knew who wore it. He knew that the throne of Jerusalem was held by Baldwin IV, a 16-year-old boy whose body was a rotting cage. To Saladin, a boy with leprosy was not a king. He was a medical curiosity. He was a footnote in a campaign that was already decided. Saladin committed the most expensive error in the history of warfare. He treated a dying man as a dead man. He looked at the fragile state of the boy and assumed the spirit inside was equally brittle. Because the boy could not feel his own fingers, Saladin assumed the boy could no longer feel the pulse of his kingdom. He let his guard collapse. He released his 26,000 men to scatter across the countryside, to raid, to loot, and to burn, believing the war was over before the first sword had been drawn. He opened a door that no amount of military genius could ever close again. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. To understand the king, you must first understand the anatomy of his suffering. Baldwin IV did not just have a disease, he lived within a biological collapse. Leprosy, specifically the leprmatous variety, is not a sudden strike. It is a slow, methodical dismantling of the human interface. It begins with the nerves. The bacteria, Mycobacterium leprae, have a specific appetite for the peripheral nervous system, the wiring that allows a human to distinguish between a soft breeze and a searing flame. In Baldwin, the bacteria had already won the initial skirmish. The protective myelin sheaths around his nerves, the insulation for his body's electrical signals, had been stripped away. His extremities were dark zones. By the age of 16, his right hand was a withered claw, the bones inside being resorbed by his own body, a process of skeletal cannibalism. His face was a landscape of nodules and thickened skin, his features dissolving into the leonine facies characteristic of the terminal stage. To the world, he was a monster. To the church, he was a living corpse, a man God had physically rejected. The stench of necrotic flesh followed him through the palace, a smell so aggressive it required constant clouds of frankincense to mask the reality of a king decomposing in real time. He wore a mask of polished silver, not out of vanity, but as a mercy to those forced to look upon him. But there is a specific type of power that comes from having nothing left to lose. When Saladin's 26,000 soldiers crossed the frontier, the court in Jerusalem panicked. The barons, healthy men with long lives ahead of them, spoke of locks and walls. They spoke of survival. They wanted to hide behind the stones of the city and pray for a miracle. Baldwin sat in the center of this chaos, a boy who could not feel his own feet, and realized that the safe option was a slow suicide. He understood that if he stayed behind the walls, Saladin would dismantle the kingdom piece by piece. The healthy men were paralyzed by the fear of death. Baldwin was not. He had already attended his own funeral mass years prior. He had already been declared legally dead by the laws of the land. He did not order the gates to be barred. He did not call for a siege. In a moment of tactical insanity that defied every military manual ever written, the boy king gave the order to prepare for a march. He would not wait for death to come to his door. He would ride out and meet it in the open. He was a teenager who could barely grip a horse's reins, preparing to hunt a sultan. The iron hinges of Jerusalem's southern gate screamed as the doors swung wide. This sound was the death knell of caution. Out of the shadows of the holy city emerged a sight that defied logic. 500 knights, the heavy cavalry of the kingdom, riding behind a silver mask. There was no fanfare. There was only the rhythmic, metallic clatter of chainmail and the heavy breathing of war horses. The mathematics were absurd. 500 men against 26,000. In any rational military simulation, this is not a battle, it is a slaughter. But the 500 men riding behind Baldwin IV were not rational. They were looking at the back of a king whose armor was strapped over open sores, a boy who had to be helped into his saddle because his legs could no longer support his weight. When the leader has already accepted the end of his world, the followers lose their fear of the dark. Baldwin drove his columns south toward the fortress of Ascalon. His strategy was a gamble built on a single, fragile observation: Saladin's arrogance. The Sultan, convinced the Christians were cowering behind their walls, had allowed his army to fracture. The 26,000 were no longer a fist. They were a spray of fingers, scattered across the Judean countryside to loot and burn. They were overloaded with plunder, their horses tired, their discipline dissolved by the ease of their perceived victory. As the king's column moved, the physical toll on Baldwin was catastrophic. A war horse is not a gentle vehicle. It is a 1,500-pound engine of muscle and bone. Every stride sent a shockwave through the saddle, grinding Baldwin's ulcerated skin against the coarse fabric of his tunic and the cold iron of his plates. Blood began to soak through his bandages, pooling in his boots. He could not feel the pain, but he could feel the wetness, a silent reminder that his body was leaking its life force into the sand. He steered the animal with his knees, his dead right arm lashed to his side, his left hand fused to the reins. He was a piece of broken machinery held together by sheer, concentrated willpower. When they reached the ridge of Montgisard, the sight below was a sea of chaos. Saladin's baggage train was mired in the autumn mud. Thousands of soldiers were unarmored, their composite bows unstrung to protect the delicate glue from the damp air. They were counting gold and herding livestock, completely unaware that the dead boy was standing on the horizon, bathed in the dying light of the afternoon sun. Baldwin did not hesitate. He did not wait for his infantry to catch up or for a better tactical window. He signaled to the Bishop of Bethlehem, who raised a gold-encased fragment of the true cross. To the knights, this wasn't a relic, it was a physical battery of divine intent. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and horse sweat. The boy king leaned forward, his silver mask touching the neck of his horse, and gave the only command that mattered. The charge of 500 heavy cavalry is not a tactical maneuver, it is a physics problem. As Baldwin lowered his arm, the silence of the ridge was obliterated by the thunder of 2,000 iron shoes striking the earth in a synchronized rhythm. This was 15 tons of armored mass, traveling at 30 miles per hour, concentrating all its kinetic energy into the tips of 80-foot ashwood lances. The Knights Templar led the vanguard. These were men who lived by a code that viewed retreat as a spiritual failure. They saw the disorganized mass of Saladin's army below, men clutching stolen silks instead of spears, officers screaming orders into a void of confusion. The Templars didn't just strike the enemy, they detonated within them. The impact was surgical and catastrophic. When the lances hit the unarmored ranks of the Ayyubid infantry, the wood did not merely pierce, it exploded. The force was enough to drive an iron point through 3 men and still have enough momentum to unseat the rider behind them. The front line of Saladin's force didn't fall, it disintegrated. Men were crushed into the mud so violently that their skeletal structures failed instantly. Saladin, the geopolitical architect, watched his masterpiece crumble in the space of a heartbeat. His elite Mamluk guards, the human weapons he had spent decades refining, were caught in the worst possible position. They were mired in the adhesive mud of the Nar Reuben riverbank, their horses weighed down by plunder, their legendary bows unstrung and useless. They were walking tanks that had been caught with their engines off. Baldwin rode in the center of the storm. He could not swing a sword with the precision of a healthy knight, but he didn't need to. His presence was a psychological toxin. The Muslim soldiers looked up through the spray of blood and mud and saw a silver mask that would not flinch. They saw a king who should have been in a hospital bed, yet he was carving a path through the most lethal fighting force in the world. Panic is not an emotion, it is a biological contagion. It started in the amygdala of a few frontline soldiers and cascaded through the 26,000 like a wildfire. When they saw the Leper King standing upright amidst the slaughter, the survival instinct overrode years of training. The greatest army of the age broke. They didn't retreat, they stampeded. Thousands of soldiers trampled their own comrades in a desperate bid to escape the ghost in the silver mask. The mud, once a minor inconvenience, became a graveyard as men drowned in inches of water, pinned down by the weight of the fleeing mob. The sun began to bleed out over the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across a landscape that had been transformed into an abattoir. The slaughter at Montgisard was no longer a battle, it was an execution. The 500 knights did not stop when the enemy's line shattered. They understood the mechanics of total victory. You do not merely defeat an empire, you break its spirit so thoroughly that it forgets how to stand. The Templars hunted the fleeing Mamluks with a systematic, cold-blooded patience. They drove the survivors toward the swollen banks of the river, where the thick, black mud acted as a secondary executioner. Saladin's personal guard, the 1,000 elite warriors in their yellow silk surcoats, threw themselves into the path of the Christian knights. They were not fighting for a kingdom anymore. They were buying seconds of time for their sultan to escape. They paid for those seconds with their lives, their bodies piling up in the silt until the river itself seemed to choke on the volume of the dead. Saladin, the man who had united the Muslim world under a single blade, was forced into a humiliation that history would never allow him to forget. He stripped off his gilded armor, the weight of his own prestige now a liability. He abandoned his war chest, his banners, and his pride. He mounted a racing camel, an animal bred for nothing but the raw speed of a coward's flight, and disappeared into the freezing desert rain. He rode for days through the Sinai, a sultan reduced to a shadow, surrounded by the starving ghosts of an army that had once numbered 26,000. Back on the field, the silence was heavier than the noise of the charge had been. Baldwin IV sat motionless on his horse. The adrenaline that had acted as a temporary bridge for his failing nervous system was beginning to evaporate, and the bill for his exertion was coming due. His bandages were no longer white. They were a dark, uniform crimson. The ulcers on his legs, ground raw by the friction of the saddle, were weeping through his armor. He looked out over the field through the narrow slits of his silver mask. He saw the tangled heaps of men and horses. He saw the glitter of abandoned gold in the mud. He had done the impossible. He had taken 500 men and used them to shatter the most powerful military force in the eastern Mediterranean. But as he sat there, the king realized a bitter truth. He had saved his city, but he could not save himself. The bacteria inside him didn't care about the victory. They didn't care about the true cross or the silver mask. They continued their slow, rhythmic demolition of his marrow and his skin. He was a 16-year-old boy who had just achieved the greatest military feat of the century, and he was still a prisoner in a rotting cage. He had won the war against Saladin, but the war against his own biology was a stalemate he was destined to lose. The aftermath of Montgisard was not a celebration. It was a clinical observation of two different types of decay. Saladin returned to Damascus a different man. He did not execute his commanders or scream at his advisors. Instead, he conducted a mental autopsy of his own arrogance. He realized that a dying man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous organism on any battlefield. He spent the next decade rebuilding his empire, not just with swords, but with a new, cold respect for the boy in the silver mask. He learned that you do not calculate around a man like Baldwin. You either destroy him completely, or you stay behind your own borders. In Jerusalem, the victory was a stay of execution. Baldwin IV had bought his kingdom time, but he had paid for it with the last of his physical currency. By 1183, the bacteria reached his optic nerves. The myelin sheaths were stripped away, and a thick, milky cloud settled over his vision. The king who had spotted Saladin's fatal flaw from a coastal tower was now completely blind. The disease then moved to his skeleton. The bone tissue in his legs resorbed, leaving his limbs as useless as dry parchment. He could no longer stand. He could no longer sit a horse. He was strapped to a wooden litter, a paralyzed figurehead carried on the shoulders of men who still feared his whisper more than they feared the Sultan's roar. Even then, when Saladin returned to besiege the fortress of Kinetic, Baldwin ordered himself carried into the desert. When Saladin heard that the Leper king was arriving on a stretcher, he retreated. He refused to fight a ghost. But the biology was final. In the spring of 1185, at the age of 24, Baldwin's lungs finally filled with the fluid of a losing battle. He had outlived every medical expectation by a decade. He had governed through willpower transmitted by a rasping, guttural whisper. When he died, the vacuum he left was catastrophic. The healthy, whole men who followed him, men like Guy de Lusignan, possessed none of his iron. They had all their fingers, all their sight, and all their strength, yet they lacked the one thing that had made Baldwin a giant: the willingness to die for a cause. Within 2 years of Baldwin's death, the kingdom he had spent his life protecting was gone. The healthy kings marched their armies into the desert without water, falling into the very traps Baldwin had avoided. They proved that a body in perfect condition is worthless if the spirit inside is hollow. Baldwin IV remains a masterclass in the power of the focused mind. He proved that a human being, rotting, blind, and paralyzed, can project a force of will so absolute that it can stop an empire. He lived as a medical tragedy, but he died as a strategic legend. The silver mask did not hide a monster. It hid a king who understood that the only real prison is the fear of the inevitable. History remembers the healthy men as footnotes, but it remembers the leper boy as iron. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.